Hello, my name is Fred Haight. Welcome to a presentation that I entitle Dvorak's Fight to Save the Very Soul of the United States. Many Americans know that the great Czech or Bohemian composer Antonin Dvorak came to this country in the late 19th century and while here composed his most famous work, the New World Symphony. A smaller number may know that during his tenure he served as Director of Composition at the National Conservatory of Music and stated that his purpose in coming to America was not to interpret Beethoven or Wagner, but to lay the foundations for an American school of classical music. He is widely quoted as saying that the foundation of such an American school of classical music would be what was then known as the Negro spirituals, the songs invented by slaves and sung with great passion as they toiled on the plantations in the Deep South. That's something that you might expect to have generated just a wee bit of controversy. Subtitle: The Controversy Unfolds. Even more controversial was that African Americans were to be included among his composition students, such as Maurice Arnold and Will Marion Cook. Now, wait a minute. This is a time in which so-called scientific racism was being promoted and taught at Harvard. This is a time in which the civil rights won by African Americans during the Reconstruction period that followed the Civil War were being reversed by the Jim Crow laws, which enforced segregation. This is a time in which that Jim Crow reaction generated degraded minstrel songs like Coon, 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 and The Coon in the Moon. And you're going to tell me that a Czech composer, doesn't speak English, never been in this country before, is just going to waltz over here and announce that he will educate the children and grandchildren of former slaves to become classical musical composers and that they can find their inspiration in the spirituals sung by their slave ancestors. You're going to tell me that that is not going to generate not just a wee bit of controversy, but a total storm of controversy, a complete freakout? It did generate a complete freakout, but you won't read about it much. Read any biography of Dvorak and you may see it mentioned as an aside or a footnote, but definitely watered down or worse, lied about and covered up. I am indebted to a company called Arts Interactive, which produced a CD-ROM entitled From the New World. A most useful section of that CD is called Direct Testimony. It reprints almost 200 documents, newspaper articles, program notes, etc., from the time of Dvorak's visit, which allow one to gain a flavor of that freakout that took place. Most of you who have some familiarity with Dvorak's visit to the United States know, or think you know, that his visit was characterized by homesickness, extreme homesickness, of such an intensity that it prevented him from succeeding in setting American themes, and that his music written here is characterized largely by Bohemian and Czech themes. I intend to prove during the course of this presentation that that characterization is a lie and a deliberate slander, and that when you encounter it in the original writings, you will discover that it is worse. It is a racist slur. Now I wish to whet your appetites and leap ahead of myself a bit by reading to you one of those original slanders. It is authored by one Philip Hale, Boston music critic and Boston Blue Blood, the nominal leader of the anti-Dvorak faction. And though it was written in 1907, 3 years after Dvorak's death, I count it as among the original slanders because Hale was involved in those original slanders and his hatred has not subsided one bit, even though the composer's been dead for 3 years. Quote, Mr. Ritter a few months ago, wrote to the sons of Dvorak, and he asked them 11 questions with this preface. I ask you to reply as soon as possible to the following questions with the utmost exactness, if not categorically, by yes or no. The first questions were concerning the use of Negro tunes in the Symphony from the New World, whether Dvorak had used them at all, or if he had, whether he had modified them. Mr. Ritter wrote letters to other Bohemians who knew Dvorak. Mr. Miloslav Rybak told him all he cared for was to compose, to lead a country life, and above all to take care of his pigeons. Among the letters known to have been written by him is one from America to a priest who had invited him to spend the summer in the country. The priest put at his disposal a donkey, and this was the decisive argument. What a pleasure this will be for my children and myself. Dvorak had no education other than that at the elementary country school. Mr. Schwerik, a music critic, once met him and asked him what he was doing. I am improving my mind, answered Dvorak, who then drew out of his pocket a little pamphlet, poorly printed, a collection of the lives of celebrated persons, Galileo, Copernicus, and others, for boys of 15 years. He was not sufficiently educated, says Mr. Rybak, to know the books mentioned. Any element that was not Czech, I do not even say Slav, was repugnant to his musical individuality. He produced so quickly that it was impossible for him to hunt for melodies in books. The conclusion of the whole matter, according to these Czechs, is as follows. 1. The New World Symphony expresses the state of soul of an uncultured Czech in America, the state of a homesick soul, remembering his native land and stupefied by the din and hustle of a new life. 2. The uncultivated Czech is a born musician, a master of his trade. He is interested only in traces of music that he finds in America. Negro airs, not copied, adapted, imitated, tint slightly 2 or 3 passages of the symphony without injury to its Czech character. 3. The symphony leaped Minerva-like from the head of this uncultured genius. As with nearly all of his other compositions, except the operas, it was not stimulated by any foreign assistance, by any consultation of authors, or by quotations, reading, etc., as was especially the case with Brahms. 4. The national Czech feeling in this work, quickened by homesickness, is so marked that it is recognized throughout Bohemia, by the learned and by the humblest. These are the conclusions of Mr. Ritter after a painstaking investigation. That Dvorak was most unhappy and pathetically homesick during his journey in New York is known to many, though Mr. Ritter does not enter into any long discussion of the composer's mental condition in this country. Yet, some will undoubtedly continue to insist that the Symphony from the New World is based, for the most part, on Negro themes, and that the future of American music rests on the use of Congo, North American Indian, Creole greaser, and cowboy ditties, yops, and whoopings. Phew! I am only surprised that he did not entitle his article Check, 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 or The Check from the Moon. That's, once again, Philip Hale in the Boston Herald, 1907. Why is it so necessary to understand the attacks on Dvorak? Can't we just accept that he did a good thing? Can't we all just get along? On one level, you can tell something about a man by who his enemies are that you could not tell just by knowing who his friends are. You can tell things by the attacks against the positive things he was doing more than you could by the mere praise of those positive things. On a deeper level, it does not surprise me that biographers sweep the matter under the rug, try to downplay it, or worse, even blame it on the wrong people. Biographers, university professors, and academics in general are afraid to address the question of cultural warfare. It's not considered academically acceptable. You might not get published if you do that, even though one can really only understand the New World Symphony as being born out of the crucible of cultural warfare. At this point, I must take a detour of a few minutes for the benefit of my listeners. What do I mean by cultural warfare? Regular warfare, military combat, is something we are highly aware of when it takes place. Cultural warfare is something of which most people have no idea. And yet, it is going on every minute and every day, whether you know it or not, being waged either against you or for you. And you may be surprised to find that more skullduggery and subterfuge take place in the battlefield of the realm of ideas than on the mere political plane. Wars are prosecuted by two sides in bitter opposition, and cultural warfare is no exception. On the one side, we have what I might term an oligarchy, and the best historical model of this is the empire. The oligarchy consists of an entrenched ruling class who really hate humanity and wish to rule over them like a bunch of sheep. That's because they themselves are not better than the people they're ruling. In fact, they're usually a whole lot worse. So their method of control is often referred to as dumbing the people down. That's an idea of which you may have heard. The opposing historical model is that of the Republic, whose leadership love humanity and seek to uplift and educate the population to a level where they could become self-governing, a true citizenry who no longer have need of an oligarchy to rule over them. That much you may find acceptable, especially the part about the oligarchy. The next, you may not. The battleground on which this war is fought is largely that of popular entertainment. Why? Advocates of the oligarchical model of social control figured out one thing. Controlling what people think is difficult. They might smell a rat. Far better to control something of which they are far less likely to be aware, how they think. And as important as what people think is what kind of emotional life they lead. Popular forms of entertainment often encourage people to attach themselves emotionally to that which is banal, maudlin, degraded, and above all, little. At this point, many of my listeners may become a little nervous and begin saying something like, well, wait a minute, are you trying to tell me that there is a conspiracy out there to control what I think? Not only control what I think, but control what my tastes are? Why, that's preposterous. I'm defined by my taste. What I like, my choices in music, entertainment, etc., that's who I am. And for you to say that somebody's controlling that is ridiculous. Popularity is the judge of everything. If something's popular, then it must be good. And I don't accept what you say. I think for myself. And I form my own opinions. Is that so? Well then, please tell me what your opinion is of Edgar Allan Poe. Do you think of him as a demented necromancer, as perhaps a genius, but certainly a mad one, obsessed with people being buried alive and bricked in behind walls, and likely an alcoholic? If that is your image of Poe, then you are a victim of cultural warfare, and you don't know the real Edgar Allan Poe. You don't know that he was engaged in defending the United States against its enemies, who waged cultural warfare against it, hoping to strangle the young republic in its crib. What did they do? Well, they tried to characterize the United States as being founded essentially by backwoodsmen and cowboys who really were only semi-literate and could never produce any decent writing, certainly not anything to rival the literature of the British Empire, and that such an uncultured nation would be very likely not to survive for very long. Poe, James Fenimore Cooper, and others set out deliberately to prove otherwise. All of this was documented decades ago by an associate of Lyndon LaRouche, Alan Salisbury, and the research has been carried forth further by others since then, and it ought to have been accepted. It ought to have overturned this notion of Poe, and yet it is not. Why? An oligarchy that seeks to degrade the public does not wish them to know their own true history, especially efforts in art, music, and literature to uplift the population, such as that carried out by Poe and Dvorak. They also don't wish you to have heroes, especially in that field. Firemen are acceptable as heroes, but heroes of the mind? No. The cultural warfare against your image of Poe has reached its most intense level with an insane TV series called The Following, in which a university professor of literature is not only a serial killer, but recruits a cult of serial killers and bases all of his murders on, guess who? Edgar Allan Poe. Nowhere does the series say that he is misrepresenting Poe. They are presented as being on the same wavelength. Before we leave this short diversion on cultural warfare, let me address one last question. I mentioned earlier that oligarchical control seeks not to control what you think, but influence how you think. How does a Republican leadership approach that matter? A Republican leadership functions on the plane not of popular entertainment, but of great art, which is indeed entertaining and at points in history has also been very popular, but it functions in a completely different way. Great art never preaches. It's never didactic. It never tries to tell you what to think. It leaves you free to think, to find a solution that is not provided in the work of art itself. Think about Shakespeare's tragedies. Do any of them give you an easy answer, an easy out, or say, just believe in these things and you'll be okay? No. You have to try to generate the solution itself. In that sense, you are the co-author of the play. And rather than trying to control how you think without you even being aware of it, great art assists you in figuring out how to think, in the sense that there are different methods of thinking, different methods of approaching a problem, and one may very well prove superior to another. Take, for example, Poe's story, The Purloined Letter. The Paris police believe they know how to think. They've been trained up the wazoo in procedures, and they can measure a table leg with the precision of a micrometer to see if the letter is stuffed in there. They search every possible hiding place, and they are stumped. They can't find it. Poe's detective Dupin, on the other hand, realizes that he must internalize the mind of his opponent. He must divine how his opponent thinks to realize how he outfoxed the Paris police. Dupin recognizes that his opponent is both a poet and a mathematician. If he had been merely one or the other, he might not have been that creative. But being both, he was. I'm not going to tell you the secret of the story. Have some fun. Read it for yourself. Now, let us return to the subject of Antonin Dvorak and his mission in the United States of America. As you might suspect, he did not decide to do this all on his own. He had help. It's well known that Dvorak was brought to the United States by Mrs. Jeanette Thurber, the founder of the National Conservatory of Music. The more I look at Mrs. Thurber, the more my respect for her leadership grows. She was the guiding hand in every aspect of this. She was one determined and courageous lady, and yet I could find no biographies of her. All I found in the entire United States was one copy of one small pamphlet about the National Conservatory of Music. I'll come back to that later. The idea of developing the United States as a cultural powerhouse as well as an industrial one was not new. Writers such as Edgar Allan Poe and James Fenimore Cooper and Washington Irving had engaged in precisely that earlier, and saw it not as an artsy-fartsy question, but a matter of survival. The idea of creating a musical culture was also not new. In 1876, the centennial of the American Revolution was celebrated at a great exposition in Philadelphia. The giant Corliss engine, the Baldwin locomotives that would be exported all around the world were proudly displayed there. Less well known is that the French operetta composer Jacques Offenbach came to that exposition and had his music performed there. I was a bit surprised to find Offenbach as the promoter of an American school of classical music, but hey, life is full of surprises, and if they're truthful, then we should not only accept them, but welcome them happily. Here is what Offenbach wrote in 1876. Quote, "So great a people should have every greatness. It should add to its industrial power the glory which the arts alone are capable of giving a nation. Since it is an announced principle in America that the state should not interfere by subventions, you must organize things yourselves. You need especially a conservatory where you can develop excellent students, if you get the right faculty, artists of merit from Europe. And this way, in just 20 years, America can stand on its own feet. 20 years for your students to become masters. 20 years for you to become no longer mere tributaries of European art. Again, that is a quote from Jacques Offenbach, writing in 1876 from Philadelphia. I don't know if Mrs. Thurber was aware of Offenbach, but she did follow his approach in many ways. After a failed attempt in creating an American School of Opera, she founded the National Conservatory of Music in 1885. She herself had been a student of the Paris Conservatory, considered the best in the world at the time, and modeled much of what she did on that. Thus, the National Conservatory became the first music school in the United States to teach solfeggio or sight singing to its students, and the first to require a degree of piano proficiency from every student. She also followed up the lead of bringing over artists of merit from Europe. Dvorak is the most famous example, but she also brought over the very best bel canto voice teachers from France and Italy and the best instrumentalists. She also believed that actors should receive training in bel canto singing even when they were singing in musicals, and as late as 1913 she secured the services of opera composer Engelbert Humperdinck to come as a successor in composition to Dvorak and Safonov. Humperdinck was not allowed to come, and he's no Dvorak, but he's probably about as good as you're going to get by 1913. The main point being that 20 years after Dvorak's visit, she was still struggling to establish a school of beautiful musical composition in the United States. And that's at a time when ugliness was beginning to set in Europe. Over time, the National Conservatory became known as better than most European conservatories, and was famed for rejecting a strict and rigid approach which kills creativity, and rather promoting a rigorous approach which is as hard work, maybe harder work, but one which can actually engender creative breakthroughs. The pamphlet that I mentioned is called 30 Years of the National Conservatory, and it is written by Henry T. Fink, one of the teachers there. The pamphlet reprints an article printed in the Washington Star in 1890 and written by the U.S. Commissioner of Education at the time, W.T. Harris. It once again demonstrates how widespread the understanding for the necessity of this development of classical culture in the United States was. Quote, I noticed with pleasure the article in a recent issue on Music in America, a talk with Mrs. Thurber on her favorite theme. No one doubts that it is time for concerted action in this country to establish and endow a National Conservatory of Music that will rank with the most famous ones of Europe. With this nation's advance in wealth, the demand for works of art rapidly increases. Our costly buildings must be ornamented with taste, or they disfigure our cities and deprave the artistic sense of our people. Our goods and manufactures must be tastefully ornamented, or they will be excluded from the markets of the world. He then goes on to quote the great German poet Goethe. Goethe remarks that a level road leads outward from music to all other arts. It is akin to poetry through rhythm and melody. It is akin to architecture, for what is architecture but frozen music? It is akin to painting, for there is a deep correspondence between colors and tones. It is likewise related to sculpture, through the fact that all great pieces of statuary exhibit figures stopped in action, stopped or fixed, as it were, in stone at the height of their action. Music is creative action rendered audible. Mrs. Thurber has proven what one person can do for the elevation of American art to a higher standard. Low art degrades, while high art ennobles. That is once again W.T. Harris, U.S. Commissioner of Education, writing in 1890, 2 years before Dvorak's arrival. Can you imagine a U.S. Commissioner of Education saying such a thing today? how many disfiguring skyscrapers would have to be torn down? Mr. Fink closes his pamphlet, 30 Years of the National Conservatory, by summarizing its activities. Quote, "The incalculable influence the National Conservatory has exerted on the musical life of the whole nation. It has provided the entire country with singers, players, teachers, organists, orchestral players, and composers who have spread the gospel of musical art in every direction." Despite strong statements by people like Mr. Harris that it was high time that there was a concerted effort to support a conservatory in the United States, Mrs. Thurber found that Offenbach's warning that the state would not support the arts and that you would have to organize things by yourself was true. She appealed to Congress for support for the National Conservatory and was turned down flat. Dvorak picked up the argument of American system economist Henry Carey and argued that the nation ought to supply the same degree of protection to its culture as it did to its manufacturers. Despite this, she had to approach philanthropists such as Andrew Carnegie for the money to support it. This was not the first time that Carnegie was involved in such an effort. The year before Dvorak's visit, in 1892, the Russian composer Tchaikovsky came to the United States on a short visit to conduct his own music for the opening of Carnegie Hall. That's an interesting story, but we must save it for another time. All of the things I have talked about the advances made by the National Conservatory for the past few minutes, are important and an integral part of the story, but in and of themselves they would have never generated any controversy, let alone a freakout. Despite the fact that she depended upon private financing for her conservatory, Mrs. Thurber wished to open the doors for subsidized education for those who displayed talent among the poor, the disadvantaged, and the handicapped. That included the blind, women, and African Americans. The latter, however, were not just another category. She had a plan in mind here. The number of African Americans who could apply was unlimited, and the tuition was to be free. As I said before, she was keenly aware of the Jim Crow laws, which were reversing the rights that African Americans had gained during Reconstruction. That Jim Crow reaction threatened not only African Americans, but the entire world. How? The great victory won by Abraham Lincoln in the U.S. Civil War that ended slavery opened up the potential of a new, bright era for the entire world. Negative developments such as the Jim Crow reaction threatened that bright future. The late 19th century was a time of two very conflicting cultural impulses. On the one hand, it was a time of great optimism and a true renaissance seemed possible. With the export of the American system of technology, Germany, Russia, Japan, and other nations were industrializing rapidly. The potential offered by the widespread use of electrical power lied just ahead in the near future. So did great inventions like the phonograph or the light bulb. People believed, and had every reason to believe, that the turn of the century, around 1900, could be the time that ushered in a whole new era for humanity. You can see that optimism reflected in the 1900 World's Fair in Paris, which featured, among other things, the building of the beautiful Eiffel Tower. On the other hand, there was also an impulse towards cultural pessimism, which culminated in the catastrophe known as World War I. If you locate Dvorak's visit to the United States in that context, then it takes on an importance far greater than it would if you merely looked at it in and of itself. She saw the most effective means to combat this as educating the children and grandchildren of former slaves to become composers of classical music. That's a diabolical plan, actually. Racists will sometimes grudgingly admit equality of those that they consider to be their inferiors in areas that are not cognitive, such as motor skills. but in cognitive areas, never. No, they can't do that. Classical music is cognitive, and its most intensely cognitive activity is composition. How do I know that this was her intent? Have I read it, written down in words somewhere? No, that does not exist. The evidence is presented in two nonlinear ways. One comes simply from knowing how a small R Republican leadership thinks and organizes. The other comes from looking at certain restrictions placed upon the project. The idea was to educate African Americans to become composers of classical music, but the restriction is that the source of this classical music would be the plantation spirituals. That cuts off a certain racist argument that might be made if they succeeded as composers, saying, well, they were just imitating the white man's music anyhow. Far more interesting is the other restriction. There were actually two sources that were being considered for this new school of American composition, that of the plantation spirituals, but also Native American music. Those two and no more. An argument might be made for the sublime beauty of the spirituals, but can the same be said of Native American music? For a homesick man, Dvorak loved taking trains in America, walking unannounced onto ships from all kinds of places in the world, all alone, and going to bars in the Bowery with his drinking buddies, where he encountered folk music of every type, including Scottish and Irish, all of which he loved. He loved every type of folk music. One of his opponents had challenged him, why not set white folk music? Whites are the majority in this country. And that's a good question. Why not set white folk music? Restricting the basis for this new American school of composition to two sources, Native American music and African American spirituals, is what I call a meta-musical idea, a political idea. Whether the United States could survive morally would depend on how it's treated its very poorest people, its most outcast people, the ones who were most denied their humanity. Elevating the status of such citizens would be the most effective way to reverse the degeneration that was going on. For those who would challenge me and say, well, you have absolutely no proof of this whatsoever, I say, come up with a better explanation, or any other explanation. To carry out such an ambitious mission, she required the right man. She needed not just a great composer, but a man of that political temperament, and Dvorak fit the bill, and she pursued him relentlessly. She wished to create a national school of music in the United States, and she knew that Dvorak was engaged in creating such a national school in his own native Bohemia. More, she knew that he was intensely political and patriotic. Dvorak's Seventh Symphony had two sources of inspiration. One, he had heard the newly completed Third Symphony of Brahms, was inspired by the new ground that it broke and wished to attempt the same thing himself. Second was his patriotic feelings in support of his own Czech people in their fight against the domination of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Listen to the following description of Dvorak's inspiration for his own Seventh Symphony. He wrote, quote, "The first subject of my new symphony flashed into my mind on the arrival of the festive train, bringing our countrymen from the countryside to the National Theatre in Prague." Unquote. At this National Theatre there was to be a musical evening to support the political struggles of the Czech people. Dvorak resolved that his new symphony would reflect this struggle, and he said that the fourth movement suggests the capacity of the Czech people to display stubborn resistance to political oppressors. He declared that the new work, quote, "must be capable of stirring the world, and may God grant that it will." He also wrote that his new symphony contained, quote, "not one superfluous note." That is a reference back to the Third Symphony of Brahms, and that question and the question of his political intent are not as completely separate matters as you might think. Let us listen to the last few minutes of that fourth movement, as performed by Raphael Kubelik and the Berlin Philharmonic. Perhaps that might give you an idea of why Mrs. Thurber sought Dvorak so vehemently. What did Dvorak see upon arriving in New York in September of 1892? From the boat, he saw one of the busiest harbors in the world, but he also saw the Statue of Liberty. After gazing at it for several minutes, he remarked, "My God, its head alone could hold 40 people." The week of his arrival happened to coincide, and I would not be at all surprised to find Mrs. Thurber having arranged this coincidence, with the beginning of a parade in honor of the 400th anniversary of Columbus's discovery of the Americas. The parade lasted for 3 days and featured every nationality. Nationalism in the Americas meant something different than elsewhere. It was not an ethnic question. Mrs. Thurber arranged for him to attend the Buffalo Bill Cody Wild West show, where he could hear authentic Native American music, And in October of 1892, he attended a concert that included patriotic American songs such as the Star-Spangled Banner and America, the song that you know by the words, "My country, 'tis of thee." He was inspired. He remarked that it was a shame to see an American patriotic song set to a British tune, for indeed it is set to "God Save the King." He immediately announced his intention to write a new national anthem for the United States, sat down at the piano, improvised a tune, and made a quick sketch which he called Motivi New York Motives, laying out the project to set this national anthem with chorus, orchestra, and baritone solo. Sadly, that project was never carried out. Too many other pressing necessities intervened. We are very fortunate, however, that his personal secretary, Joseph Kovařič, was there when Dvorak improvised the theme and informed us that if you wish to hear Maestro's planned tune for "My Country 'Tis of Thee," just listen to beginning measure 17 of the slow movement of the string quintet, not the more famous string quartet, but the string quintet that he composed when living in the summer in Spillville, Iowa. Let us listen to that now and see if you cannot match the words of "My Country 'Tis of Thee" against the music. Keep in mind that the last line of each verse repeats, so you hear "Of thee I sing and let freedom ring" twice. How very different than the excerpt from the Seventh Symphony that we just listened to. I find it amazing that a man born into poverty and so intensely involved with the struggles of his own people could come over to the United States and so quickly internalize the situation in this country and produce such beautiful American music. He was truly a universal genius. Mrs. Thurber assured that Dvorak would be familiarized with the Negro spirituals by having a young African-American singer, Harry Burleigh, come over to his apartment in New York and sing them for him on a regular basis. She also swung it so that Burleigh became the established regular singer at the most blue-blood Episcopalian church in New York City, the one attended by J.P. Morgan. How did she do that? Many singers auditioned. She made sure that they auditioned behind a blind so that the judges could not see the singer. They could not tell what complexion they were. They had to judge them by their voice and their voice alone. They chose Burleigh as having the best voice. The first Sunday that Burleigh sang, the entire congregation boycotted the service. He stuck to his guns, though, and at first became grudgingly accepted and then much loved and sang at that church for the rest of his life. Burleigh sang the spirituals to Dvorak and reports that the maestro commented upon one, "Go Down Moses," that it was a theme worthy of Beethoven. What does that mean? It means that Beethoven would have seized upon it, welcomed it, and used it as a basis for musical development. Let us listen to Harry Burleigh himself sing "Go Down Moses." It's a very old recording, and Burleigh was very old when he recorded it, so his voice is past its prime. Please excuse the poor sound quality on both counts. I could have used a more modern recording, but I wish to give you a window into time. Burley's conception of the song is likely to have remained consistent. Put yourself in Dvorak's shoes and imagine hearing this for the first time. Dvorak loved the spirituals, but he was also not just musical, he was intensely political. Burley tells of Dvorak's countless demands to recount not just the music of his people, but the struggles of his people. Burley hailed from Erie, Pennsylvania, where his family had been heavily involved with the Underground Railroad, helping escape slaves across the border into promised freedom. It's hard to imagine that Burley would not have regaled Dvorak with tales of the Underground Railroad, but also revealed to him the hidden meaning in many of these spirituals that was designed to aid the escaped slaves in finding their way along the Underground Railroad. Subtitle: The War Begins. On the 21st of May, 1893, an article titled "Real Value of Negro Melodies" appeared in the New York Herald. In that article, Dvorak is quoted as saying, quote, "In the Negro melodies of America, I have discovered all that is needed for a great and noble school of music. They are pathetic, tender, passionate, melancholy, solemn, religious, bold, merry, gay, or what you will. They are American. They come from the soil. They are the folk songs of America, and your composers must turn to them. There is nothing in the whole range of composition that cannot be supplied with themes from this source." That was a bold statement, and it unleashed a storm of controversy. Dvorak was immediately denounced as a Negrophile. The Boston music critic, whom we have heard quoted before, Philip Hale, pronounced that Negroes were unmusical and learned whatever they did know from the singing of white women, and that the Slavic music of Dvorak, Tchaikovsky, Smetana et al. Was inferior to German music, especially Brahms, ignoring the fact that it was Brahms who was Dvorak's chief promoter. Neither was he sincere, though, in his defense of Brahms and German music against Slavic music. 5 months later, in the same year, 1983, he wrote, quote, "I do not like and I cannot like the C minor symphony of Brahms. I am willing to admit without argument that the symphony is grand and impressive and all that. So is a Channel Fog. This C minor symphony seems to me the apotheosis of arrogance." That's, once again, Boston music critic Philip Hale in October of 1893, trashing the very same Johannes Brahms who he had earlier held up as a model of German racial superiority in music, as opposed to the Slavic inferiority of Dvorak. This should not surprise us too much. Racists are really not motivated as much as they would like you to believe by their hatred against whoever it is they happen to be hating at the moment. They hate humanity as a whole, and above all they seek division, and what really freaks them out is anything that might unify humanity. The reaction to this article in the New York Herald was fast and furious. 8 Boston musical authorities, including the dean of Harvard's Faculty of Music, were recruited to denounce Dvorak on this question of Negro music. A week later, May 28th, the Boston Herald featured a lengthy article printing the responses of all 8 of these experts. American composers such as Daniel Gregory Mason and Edward McDowell joined in the fray, insisting that only Anglo-Saxon values as established in New England could be the basis of any national school of music. Mason went so far as to say that Jews coming to America posed a threat to the culture. The New York Herald continued to print articles over the course of that week and claimed to have somehow engaged the services of a special correspondent in Europe who somehow claimed to have obtained private audiences with such renowned composers and musicians as Anton Bruckner, Anton Rubinstein, and Joseph Joachim, to name a few, and that he put it directly to these composers whether they thought it were possible to base a school of musical composition upon folk songs, especially Negro folk songs from America. Articles in the New York Herald on that special correspondent's findings were accompanied by subtitles such as "Herr Rubinstein is dubious" and "A cold water douche." If you read the actual statements by all of these people, though, you will find that some of them are hostile, but a great many are ambivalent or even cautiously supportive yet dubious. In a way, that's because the question as posed in that form is a lie. You can't understand this question of slave spirituals as the basis of a national school of composition without understanding the political intent. Great composers have always intervened on popular music, whether it be hymns, folk songs, or something else. The intent is to take simple things that people think they know and take for granted and show by transforming them a greater potential in both the music and the people listening to the music. That's a very important part of classical music, but it's not the whole thing. Bring up that question to a composer, and he might understand what you're talking about. If you simply walk up to an accomplished musician and say, "Do you believe that folk songs, of any type, can be the basis for a national school of composition?" they're very likely to scratch their heads and to respond as Joseph Joachim is reported to have responded to the special correspondent. "I can't answer that in a few minutes. You'd have to write a book on it." At the time, many people did not believe that Dvorak had actually made those statements. They thought that words, provocative words, had been put into his mouth. When put on the spot as to whether he had actually made those statements, Dvorak never denied making them and never indicated any disagreement with their intent. However, he also didn't fall into the trap of acknowledging, "Yes, I made those statements verbatim as you read them." He answered the question by elevating it to a higher level, a more truthful level than the simple yes or no that his opponents might have desired. He once answered that question by saying that he looked to the poor to do the hard work necessary to become composers, that he doubted if wealthy people would have the drive to work as hard as the poor did. That was a very important statement. He himself had grown up poor, had to work against all odds to become a composer. He knew what it took. And he was a very demanding and tough taskmaster. His students had to write a certain number of pages of music per week, otherwise you are no composer. And they had to take a theme and put it through a certain number of measures of Durchführung, taking a theme and putting it through all possible harmonic and contrapuntal transformations. He once walked out of a composition class with a smile on his face and said, "I killed them all." And when a student presented a work to Dvorak that Dvorak was very critical of, and argued that, well, Dr. Dvorak, it's just a matter of taste. I like my music and you don't. Dvorak stared at him hard for about 30 seconds and said, "Oh, so you then are the musician and I am the ass?" Subtitle: The Freakout Continues Today. The article that appeared on May 21st, 1893 in the New York Herald entitled "Real Value of Negro Melodies" was unsigned. Today, however, it is generally accepted that it was written by one James Creelman. Creelman was a very famous journalist, favorable to Dvorak and friend of Mrs. Thurber, but he was also a practitioner of what was known as yellow journalism. The yellow does not refer to what you might think. It's not quite as bad as that. It refers to a comic book character who was always getting into mischief. But yellow journalism referred to itself as the journalism that acts. They believed that if a cause was moral and just and needed to be acted upon, that journalism had an obligation to bring that action into being, and they had no problem putting words into people's mouths if that aided that cause. That may seem deplorable to us today, but bear in mind that today we have many supposedly objective journalists who are working behind the scenes to bring about desired political manipulations and results. Perhaps the yellow journalists were only a little bit more honest about what they were doing. A modern biographer of Dvorak, Joseph Horowitz, goes so far as to say that Creelman and Mrs. Thurber conspired to put these words into Dvorak's mouth, that they conspired to put what would be considered provocative words into his mouth in order to bring about what they knew would occur, a knee-jerk reaction out of the Boston Brahmins. He claims that the freakout was limited to Boston, that democratic New York was not affected at all. He basically says that the entire thing was a publicity stunt on the part of Thurber and Creelman, and that if they had not published that article in that form at that time, then there would not have been a freakout at all. And Dvorak's visit might have drawn a lot less attention than it ended up doing. For a lot of reasons, that doesn't make any sense at all. But it's worse. It trivializes the most important musical intervention into the United States in its history. It trivializes one of the most important interventions, musical or non-musical, anywhere, ever. As I said before, she saw the enactment of the Jim Crow segregation laws as threatening the rights won by African Americans during the Reconstruction period. But it was more than just a threat to African Americans, it was a threat to all humanity. Why? The great victory won by Abraham Lincoln in the U.S. Civil War, the victory that ended slavery, promised to open up a bright new future of freedom for the entire human race. Reversing those victories could send not just the United States, but the world back into a dark age. The late 19th century was a time of two very different conflicting cultural impulses. On the one hand, there was much reason to believe that a new Renaissance was possible. Great works of art, such as those composed by Brahms and Dvorak, were still being produced. The American system of technology was spreading everywhere. Russia, Japan, and Germany were developing industrially very quickly, and people in backwoods areas were being lifted up. Great inventions such as the phonograph and the light bulb lay just around the corner. And with the light bulb would come electrical power, which did so much to change the lives of people. On the other hand, there was also a great impulse towards cultural pessimism. By the early 1900s, Brahms, Dvorak, and Verdi were all dead, and ugliness began to replace beauty in art. Schoenberg wrote his first atonal piece in 1908, only 15 years after the composition of the New World Symphony. That cultural pessimism, combined with the political machinations of empires and other negative factors, fed into a vortex, a downward spiral that led into the cataclysm that became known as World War I. Locate Dvorak's mission in the United States in that context, and it takes on a completely different meaning than it would in and of itself. As I said before, Mrs. Thurber saw this reversal of the civil rights won by African Americans and found that the most effective way to combat it was to educate the children and grandchildren of former slaves to become composers of beautiful classical music. That's a diabolical plan. Racists will admit, even if grudgingly, equality on the part of those who they consider to be racially inferior in areas that are not cognitive, such as motor skills. But cognitive equality they can never accept. Classical music is cognitive, and its most intensely cognitive activity is composition. How do I know that she thought this way? Have I found it in writing somewhere? No, that doesn't exist. The proof is presented in two non-linear forms. First, you have to know something about the history of what I call small R Republican leadership, how they thought and how they organized. Second, you have to look at certain conditions and restrictions which she and her collaborators put upon the project. One of which was that the African Americans who they were educating to be composers would be able to find all the inspiration they needed in their own cultural heritage, the spirituals. What does that do? Among other things, it cuts off the possibility of a racist argument that might say, were they to succeed, oh well, they were just imitating the white man's music anyhow. An even more interesting restriction was that there was to be another source, a second source of inspiration for this new American music, Native American music. Those two, African American spirituals and Native American music, and no others. An argument can be made as to the sublime beauty of the spirituals, but can the same be said of Native American music? What's going on here? For a homesick man, Dvorak enjoyed taking trains all over the United States, walking onto foreign ships unannounced to talk with complete strangers who spoke foreign languages, and going to the bars of the Bowery with his drinking buddies where he encountered every type of folk music imaginable, including Scottish and Irish, all of which he loved. One of his detractors had challenged him, why not set white men's folk music? That's the majority of people in this country. If you want to write American music, then set white folk songs. And that's a very good question. Why not set white folk songs? The commitment to make the plantation spirituals and Native American music the basis of this new American school of composition is what I call a meta-musical idea or a political idea. Whether the United States would find the fitness to morally survive would depend on how it treated its very poorest people, the people most denied their humanity. Developing and uplifting their music was one of the most effective ways to establish their humanity. That, to me, is the strongest factor in demonstrating how Mrs. Thurber and her collaborators thought. If you disagree, then I challenge you to come up with another explanation. Epilogue. In Part 2, I will walk you through the New World Symphony, another one of my interminable tours. The reason for that is twofold. Many people have read a novel or a play and have a sense of it as an entirety. Fewer have done that with the symphony. But in the case of this symphony, it has a political story to tell every bit as compelling as what I just went through, and I don't believe it's a story that's been told before. So that'll be part 2. I wish to end part 1 on a high note, a beautiful note. The last great thing that Dvorak did in the United States before returning home was to lead a concert for charity in January of 1894 at Madison Square Gardens. Almost all of the musicians there were students of the National Conservatory. The highlight was Dvorak's own arrangement of Stephen Foster's song, Old Folks at Home. A chorus of about 130, all African Americans and all students of the National Conservatory. An orchestra about half that size, again all African Americans and all students of the National Conservatory. And Harry Burleigh as baritone soloist waited attentively for Dvorak to begin the piece. They knew that they had to prove something to an unbelieving world. Some of my more astute listeners may protest and say, well, wait a minute, Foster was white. I thought the idea was to set black spirituals. Dvorak felt that Stephen Foster's songs captured the plantation atmosphere, and apparently so did all of the African American singers who sang it with him. In the pre-Civil War period, European travelers report hearing slaves on plantations singing many of Foster's songs, and they questioned what was the degree to which Foster had actually copied his music from the plantation songs. Thus, even though Foster was nominally white, Dvorak picked an area that was gray, shall we say. Just before the song began, the concert leader of the orchestra walked up to Dvorak and presented him a gold-mounted ebony baton in deep appreciation of all that he had done. Let us end part 1 by listening to that arrangement of Old Folks at Home by Dvorak.
my kind old mother, there let me live and die. Among the bushes, one that I love, still sadly to my memory rushes, no matter where I rove. When will I see the bees a-humming all round the comb? When will I hear the banjo strumming down in my good old home? And down the whole creation sadly I roam, still longing for the old plantation and for the old folks at home.
When Dvorak died in 1904, an American paper wrote that the tears of Afro-Americans alone could have filled his grave. I'll meet you in part 2.